So I just got back this week from a convention I went to. It's called the Preaching and Teaching Convention. It's held every year at Ozark Christian College in Joplin, Missouri. It was my alma mater, so I love going to that conference because I get to see a lot of my professors and a bunch of my fellow classmates go back for that one, so I get to see a lot of people. But there's a lot of really good teaching that goes on at that convention. This year they were going through 1 Peter, and so the theme they had for the conference was no matter what, holy living in a hostile land, because that's what the book of 1 Peter is all about. And so I appreciate you guys giving me the time to go out earlier this week and participate in that. But the first night of that conference, there was a speaker there. I believe his name was Caleb Kaltenbach, I think is his last name. I can't ever pronounce that right. But he was the author of a book called Messy Grace. And in that book, I think he kind of lays out his life story. I haven't read it yet. I got the book to read. But basically his story is that he was raised in the LGBT community. He had two moms, and from a very young age, they would take him to the pride parades and all of those things, and he was raised being told that Christians hated them. And then he became a Christian, and then he became a pastor. And so he writes this book called Messy Grace about how to love others without sacrificing your convictions. And then how he could, has to love people in that community even though he believes that it's wrong. But his sermon wasn't even about that topic. He's got this amazing testimony and this great story, but that's not what his sermon was about. I'd mention that because you have to know that to understand the illustration that I'm stealing from him. But basically, a couple of years ago, you might remember the Supreme Court ruled that homosexual marriage was legal in all 50 states in the United States. And he said the day that happened, he had a Christian walk up to him, put his hand on his shoulder and say, "Well, you tried. You did your best." And he's like, "Wait, what?" And he said, the ruling. And he just goes on and they get to talking, and he says the guy just ended up walking away with his head down, dragging his feet. And his point was that all too often this world acts against us. And then we walk around with our head down, we're dragging our feet as if somehow we've been defeated. When the Supreme Court disagrees with Scripture, does that mean that Scripture is proven false? No. Does it mean that we've lost, that all hope is gone? No. Does it mean that the victory that Jesus purchased on the cross is no longer valid? Does it mean that God is no longer on the throne? No. None of that is the case. And yet all too often we lose a political battle or we get upset about something that's going on in our culture and we walk around as if, oh no, woe is me. And he was preaching on celebrate salvation, celebrate the victory we have. Sometimes I wonder if Christians in America are fighting all of these battles for the wrong reasons. Are we trying to guide our communities in ways that are right, in ways that are just and moral? Or are we somehow trying to prove that we're right? Are we trying to prove Christianity is true? Because one of those things I think is an admirable goal, and the other one I think is kind of pointless. You're not going to accomplish that in that sphere. And I worry that all too often we're fighting these battles from a place of fear. We're afraid, well, if people believe that, it's going to mean doom and gloom for Christianity. Or if people believe that, they won't come to Jesus. Somehow if that's legal or if that is the predominant view, that means people aren't going to love Jesus anymore. But do you hear the fear that we're expressing in these things? But one thing I've learned from the second half of Luke 8 is that fear has no place in the life of the faithful. We're going to start today in Luke 8, verse 22. I'm just going to read the story. It says, "One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, 'Let's go across to the other side of the lake.' So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water, and they were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, 'Master, Master, we are perishing. Do you hear the fear?' They're afraid for their safety. They're afraid their boat's going to sink. They're just afraid. He awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled to one another, "Who is this then, that he commands even the winds and water, and they obey him?" Where is your faith, he asks. And I read that question, I think, okay, what is he driving at with that? Is he saying that, maybe you should have had enough faith, that you should have told the storms to calm down? I mean, later he does tell the disciples that they will do greater things than he ever did. So maybe he was saying, you should have had enough faith, you should have just done this and not woken me up. Or maybe it's more of the, why are you so afraid? Don't you have enough faith to believe that God would keep us safe to the other side of the lake? Why are you so scared? I don't know. Either way, their fear reveals a lack of faith, because fear has no place in the life of the faithful. After Jesus calms the storm, it says then they were afraid. It never mentions their fear. It implies it, and we understand they're afraid, but it never mentions it until after the storm is gone. Then it says they're afraid. But now it's a different kind of fear, because now they're marveling at Jesus. Who is this who commands the winds and the water, and they obey him? Anybody can command the winds and the waves, but it's actually getting them to listen. That's the accomplishment there. About 500 years before this incident, in 480 BC, King Xerxes of Persia was trying to invade Greece. And he has to march his army across into Europe, and to get there he had to cross now it's called the Dardanelles Strait, then it was called the Hellespont, but he has to get across this body of water, and it's this real narrow strip. So he gets all his engineers together and he says, okay guys, how are we going to cross? And they say, well, let's build a pontoon bridge, basically a floating bridge. We'll get all these ships and string them together and we can just walk right across. So they get 672 ships all tied together and all lined up, and they're getting ready to cross, and a big storm comes through. Tears the whole thing apart. All the ships are lost. Xerxes is furious. He's so mad. He has all the engineers on the project that, he has them executed for shoddy craftsmanship. But what are you going to do about the weather? That's the realm of the gods, right? So in order to establish that he's angry with them for this, and to establish that he is in control here, he orders his men to go into the water and whip the sea 300 times. They throw stones in the air. They take some handcuffs and they throw them in the water, because he is saying, I am in control here. They rebuild the bridge. They march on into Greece, and he runs into King Leonidas and Thermopylae and the 300. You might know that story. Basically, he does not have a good time trying to invade. They end up having to retreat. They come back to the Dardanelles Strait, and guess what they find? There's no pontoon bridge there anymore. Again, it's been destroyed yet again. He commanded the wind and the sea. He tried to declare his authority over them, but they weren't listening. The disciples were afraid for their safety. But if you have faith in the one who can control the storm, you don't have any need to fear it. When the Creator speaks, creation can't not respond. And so when we have faith in him, our own safety pales in priority, because we know he can calm the storm. He can command the winds and the waves. He can take care of my safety. If I have faith in that, I don't have to fear the storm. Romans 8:28 says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Do we have faith in that? Do we believe that? Now, it's not saying that there won't be storms. There are going to be storms, but it's saying that God can bring good about through those storms. We don't have to fear them if we have faith in him. Now, this is also not saying that we can be stupid and get away with it. We shouldn't be taking every shortcut through every dark back alley because, God works all things together for good. Nothing bad can happen. That's not what it's saying either. We need to use all the wisdom God has given us. But when God calls us, When God asks something of us, our personal safety is a non-issue. Because that kind of fear has no place in the life of the faithful. But there are other types of fear, aren't there? There's more than just fearing for my safety. Look at verse 26. This is kind of a well-known story, and my sermon's a bit longer this morning, so I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to basically recount. Jesus, they are in the boat crossing the sea. And then when they land on the other side, they come to this region, and they're confronted by a man with demons in him. And he has been the people have tried to control him, contain him, and chain him down, but he breaks out, he tears off all the clothing and runs out into the wilderness. He's just a wild man. And Jesus commands the demons in him to come out. And they say, don't throw us into the abyss, throw us into those pigs over there. So he throws them into the pigs all go crazy and run into the sea and die. I'm going to pick up the story in verse 34. It says, when the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Then people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it told them how the demon-possessed man had been healed. And then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. They were afraid. 2 times it says they were afraid of Jesus. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that their livelihood has just been destroyed. And here is this man with a power that they can't comprehend. This demon-possessed man that they tried to contain, they tried to control, and they could not. They did everything in their power, and they failed. And yet 5 minutes with Jesus, and next thing you know, he's sitting there calm, clothed, and in his right mind, and they think this is a power that I don't understand. And I'm sure they were angry at losing their livelihood, but there's nothing they can do about it because, well, Jesus is more powerful than anything they could do. I don't want to have to bump heads with this guy because I don't know what he could do to me. So out of fear for their livelihood and well-being, they ask him to leave because they can't stop him from doing whatever he wants. And they can't keep him around for fear of what he might do. He's already decimated their economy. And so for fear of their livelihood, they ask Jesus to leave. Rather than letting the fear of him lead them to faith and trust and belief, as it did for the disciples after the storm, they ask Jesus to leave. They're too scared to keep him around. When I see people's faith and the practicalities of life come to heads, it breaks my heart how often I see the practicalities of life take priority. Well, I know this company's corrupt and I shouldn't be doing these things, but I really need this job. I can't not have this job. Oh, we can't give 10% to God. We don't have the money. We can't afford to get married. There's just too many things complicating everything. We can't afford to live the way God says to live. We can't do that. And what breaks my heart is not that those statements are false. It's not that they're lying about any of this. I don't doubt that they're true. What breaks my heart is the lack of faith that allows that fear to make those justifications in the first place. Faith would say, well, I need this job, but I'm not crossing that line. It's wrong. And I'm going to trust God to take care of it in the meantime if the worst should happen. Faith says, well, we don't have any extra money right now, but we're going to bring the whole tithe anyway. It might not all be monetary, but we're going to give everything we can. And we're going to trust God to fill in the gaps. Faith says we might have to live differently than we're used to or we'd like to, but our relationship is going to honor Jesus. And we're going to trust him to take care of the rest. They were so scared of Jesus that rather than letting him take the fear away, they sent him away instead. And the really sad thing is that he went. If we have to choose between Jesus and something else, and we choose that something else, we're telling Jesus to leave, and we need to be careful because he just might do it. And this account actually has a strange ending. If you look at verse 38, the man from whom the demons had gone, begged that he might be with Jesus. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." And he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. Here we have this formerly demon-possessed man requesting to follow Jesus. "Let me follow you." And Jesus tells him no. Now, I'm sure part of the reason for this request was out of love and devotion for the man who just saved him. But I also wonder if there's not a big part of this coming from a place of fear. Because now he has to go back into town and look those people in the eyes. People who no longer would call him by his real name, that they might probably just refer to him as Legion. People that he's terrorized for years. People who may blame him for the loss of all those pigs. People, he's got to face children now who have never known him as anything but an object to be feared. You don't think there's a little bit of fear behind this request? "Jesus, don't make me go back there." But Jesus sends him away. And this man's faith in Jesus overcomes any fear that he has for his livelihood, for his well-being. And he goes and he begins preaching there and in the surrounding region. And Jesus left that day. But later he would come back to that side of the lake. And that time 4,000 people come to hear him speak. And I wonder if the preaching of this man had anything to do with that region's change of heart toward Jesus. What story would you rather have? A story about how you wanted to follow Jesus, but the practicalities in life just wouldn't allow it at the time? Or a story about how Jesus helped you through a situation when you didn't see any way through it? Because a life of fear will get you one result, and a life of faith will get you the other. Fear has no place in the life of the faithful. But there are other fears. There's more than just our safety or our livelihood. Look at verse 40. "Now when Jesus returned back to the original side of the lake, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of a synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased." Let's pause there for a minute. Here we see two different people. We see Jairus and this woman. And both of them are afraid for their health. You read through Jairus' request and you can hear the desperation dripping from this. It's his only child, his little girl. She's only 12. She's dying. And in the rush to get there and the crowd's getting there, you see this woman with this flow of blood. She's been suffering for as long as this little girl has been alive. She's broke. She's desperate. She's got no hope. She's scared. Have you ever been scared for your health? Probably the sickest that I can ever remember being, I was about the age of this little girl. I was 12 years old and I had a high fever. I was sick as a dog for days on end. Turns out I had appendicitis. I'm sure it was a lot more scary for my parents than it was for me. I went in, I had the surgery 2 days later, I'm back home. I've got a little bitty scar. I've got stretch marks bigger than the scar now. But I'm sure it was pretty scary for my parents. When Ruth was somewhere between 1 and 2, we noticed something weird going on with some of her veins, and so we took her in to check it out, and they did some tests on her heart, and so to do the MRI, they had to put her under. Seeing your little 1-year-old girl get put into that machine, that's a little moment of, it just kind of makes you sick to your stomach a little bit. It was a little scary, but those aren't nearly as bad as what some of you have faced. Maybe some of you are facing it now. Some of you have heard the doctors use the dreaded C word. You've had to go round after round of dealing with cancer. You've watched as loved ones as their health declines, and there's nothing you can do but watch. It can be scary, can't it? Have you ever noticed that almost all of our prayer requests in church revolve around somebody who's sick? And that's not a bad thing. I mean, a good portion of Jesus' ministry was healing people that they brought to him because they were sick. It is a legitimate request. But my question today is, why are we so afraid of being sick? You get to verse 44, and she reaches out and she touches him, and she's healed. And Jesus said, "Who is it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd are surrounding you and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." When the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling. Falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." When this woman's faith overcame her fear of being told one more time that there is nothing to be done, when her faith overcame her fear of all of the social implications of, a woman actually approaching a man or actually touching a man, when her faith overcame her fear, that's when she was healed. Her faith made her well. We serve a God who has authority over sickness and disease. We have nothing to fear from sickness. Yeah, but what about all those times when he doesn't heal? What about those times? Should we be afraid of that? 2 Corinthians 12, Paul tells a personal story about himself. He says, to keep him from being conceited, he says, because of this, he says, a thorn was given me in the flesh. In his flesh. I think this is a physical ailment that Paul had to deal with. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. I mean, this is Paul we're talking about here. Paul is somebody who, healed people, who raised the dead. He had that kind of a ministry, and yet he prays for himself, and God says, nah. God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, Paul says, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness. I'm content with insults and hardships, persecutions and calamities. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. Paul's faith was such that even when he suffered physically, even when God said, no, I'm not going to heal that, when he suffered hardships and persecutions and calamities, when his life was falling apart, he was content. I'm sure he wasn't exactly happy about it, and I'm sure he wasn't ecstatic that he had this horrible thing that he had to deal with. But he didn't let the fear of that keep him from doing what he knew he needed to do. He didn't keep him from serving God faithfully. He had faith in those moments that even though I'm too weak, God's power can work through this. God's strength is going to shine through all the more. Fear has no place in the life of the faithful. But what if it's more serious than even that? What if it's more serious than just another disease? What if being faithful would require your very life? Now, this isn't something that should be possible in the United States. We have laws against this type of thing, but that's not the case in other places around the world. It hasn't always been true historically. So there's a possibility that someday this could be us. It's happened a few times here in the United States that I'm aware of. Columbine, you remember the story? The Columbine shooters came through. They had one girl at gunpoint. And they say, do you believe in God? She says, yes. Bang. Why? Should a fear of death keep us from living faithfully for God? Look at verse 49. Remember, they were on their way to Jairus' house in the first place when the woman interrupted. Verse 49 says, while he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." And when they came to his house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the father and the mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her. But he said, "Do not weep, for she's not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. Did you hear what Jesus told them when they heard the bad news? Don't fear, only believe. You know, in the Greek, the word for faith and the word for believe, they've got the same root. It's the same word. Faith drives out fear. We serve a Lord of life. What fear does death hold? Again, this doesn't mean that death is a good thing or that we should seek it out. Death is the final enemy. It's the consequence of living in a fallen world. But we serve a God of the living. We serve a God who says things like, "Child, arise," who says things like, "Lazarus, come forth," who says things like, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, for he is risen." We need to have the same faith that Jesus displayed in the garden when he said, "Let this cup pass from me. I don't want to do this, but not my will. Yours be done." I love the way Paul sums it up in Philippians 1. He says, "For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which shall I choose? I can't tell. I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ. That's better by far. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account." Do you hear what he's saying? If I'm blessed to continue living, I get to keep on preaching and keep on ministering for Christ. I get to keep living by faith. If they decide they don't want me to do that, then they can kill me and I get to go home. Either way, I win. His faith was such that no matter what happened, he wins. There's no room for fear in that. There's nothing to be afraid of in that scenario. Fear has no place in the life of the faithful. I'm going to close with probably my favorite story from the Titanic. Remember the ocean liner that struck the iceberg on their maiden voyage and sank April 14th, 1912. There's a story about a man named John Harper who was traveling back to America with his daughter. And as the call was issued for passengers to vacate their cabins, he wraps his daughter in a blanket. He looks her in the eye and he tells her that she will see him again. He passes her to one of the crewmen, and after watching her safely board one of the lifeboats, he removes his life jacket, gives it to somebody else. And people heard him shouting. One survivor distinctly remembered hearing him shout, "Women, children, and the unsaved first." Women, children, and the unsaved. He knew that believers were ready to die. The unsaved weren't there yet. And Harper ran along the decks pleading with people to turn to Christ. And with the ship sinking, he called out to the orchestra and he said, "Guys, play 'Nearer, My God, to Thee.'" Gathering people around him on deck, he then knelt down. And with holy joy in his face, he raised his arms in prayer. As the ship began to lurch, he jumped into the icy waters and swam frantically to all he could reach, beseeching them to turn to the Lord and be saved. Finally, as hypothermia set in, John Harper sank beneath the water and passed into the Lord's presence. 39 years old. Do you hear any fear in that story? Fear has no place in the life of the faithful. You know, when I'm picking out songs for Sunday, I try to pick out songs that'll go along with the sermon. But I didn't pick any songs out this morning that had to do with fear. Because this is not a sermon about fear. This is a sermon about a God who drives out fear. This is a sermon about a God who commands the winds and the waves and they obey him. This is a sermon about a God who has authority over demons, over disease, even death itself. And if we have faith in a God like that, there's simply no room left for any kind of fear. That's why fear has no place in the life of the faithful. Let's pray. Father God, I praise you that you are an awesome God. That you are great beyond our comprehension. That you are firmly in control no matter how crazy this life gets. Father, help us to keep that firmly in our sights at all times. So that no matter what this world throws against us, no matter what Satan tries to deceive us with, that we might have no fear, for you are with us.